Good morning and welcome to the Bookum Nook Show. My name is Kyle Colley, and this is a special episode of Author Talks Podcast, a podcast about hearing the behind the scenes stories, ideas, and writing journeys of authors. This episode is brought to you by Bookum, the book community's new and best way to host dynamic online book clubs. Download the app and start your book club today at www.bookumapp.com. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. My guest today is the insightful Jimmy Soni. Jimmy is a writer and the author behind the book, The Founders. It's the story of PayPal. Additionally, Jimmy wrote the book, A Mind at Play, a biography on the life of Claude Shannon. Jimmy is a speaker. He's a speechwriter, a creator, an entrepreneur, and he's also a dad. Jimmy, welcome to the Author Talk podcast.
Well, Kyle, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to talk with you today. I kind of want to start a little bit before the book. Just kind of like what books inspired you growing up? Like, what are some books that kind of shaped your life in a sense?
Oh man, what a great question. And it's funny too, because I have a 9-year-old and she's into books. And so this is like what happens when you have a kid is you relive the parts of your childhood that you can remember, And so it's really interesting because I'll give you an example. This is answering your question, but she's really into graphic novels. And I remember when I was a kid, my equivalent of that was I was really into Garfield comics. Those books,
Yeah.
like they ran the comic in the newspaper, but then they would print the books. So I would like obsessively read like Garfield comics, Calvin and Hobbes, all those comic books. But no, like I would say I was a devoted reader always when I was a kid. My favorites when I was growing up, there was this series that was by Brian Jacques, the late Brian Jacques, and it was the Mossflower and Madame series. It was like this fantasy series, those like little rodents, like kind of who become characters and stuff. I read every one of those books. I mean, I think I read those books as soon as they came out. I loved Encyclopedia Brown. I liked the Choose Your Own Adventure books, and one of the sort of the things I remember now in hindsight that I probably reveal more about your psychology than you think is when I was reading the Choose Your Own Adventure books, if it came to a page where I had to pick a path, like the way those books work, I think maybe some of your listeners are familiar with it, but you are kind of like guided through the pages, and then at the bottom of the page, you'll be forced to make a choice, like go through door A or go through door B. And what I would do is I would dog ear the pages where I had to make a choice, so that I could go back and like make a different choice if I didn't like the outcome. And so it actually is pretty funny. I was thinking about that. I'm like, wonder what that says about me, that I was basically postponing these choices, or giving myself the ability to go back and undo them. I love to Choose Your Own Adventures. I like R.L. Stine was one of my favorite authors. I basically would growing up, like what I did during the summers is I went to the library with my mom and my brother, and we would just go to the library like basically all day long. And then we would get books out from the library and come home. And that was it. That was like my whole summer was around books. And so I was just always reading. Like it was basically the thing that I used just to escape from everything. And for me, it's hard to even like pin down favorite books. But I would say you sort of said, like, gun to your head, like what really inspired you when you were growing up, it was the Mossflower and Madame series. Because those worlds, I mean, he was constructing entire worlds, right? And it was really like when you're a kid, you get wrapped into the adventure of it. And then as I got older, my taste shifted to nonfiction, and I basically just became like a devoted reader of history.
Yeah, it shows through your writing. Like even when you're talking about the Founders book today, the way you weave that story and how you tell two different sides of the story and where they were at in that moment, like where Elon was at in his moment and Peter Thiel and Max where they were at, and you kind of weave them. It really does play out like a movie in the book. And then
thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah,
that's very kind of you to say. It's very kind of you to say too, because it's something I'm trying to do. So I think authors all have different ambitions when they write books. But one of the things that one of my ambitions for my books is like, it shouldn't be boring. Like it shouldn't feel like doing homework, right? Like this is people give you, if you're an author, the exchange, the trade is you're giving me your time, which none of us have enough time, right? You're giving me your time in exchange for information. But it doesn't mean that the information should be boring to get through, right? Like, especially if you do the kind of work I do, you're not going to make stuff up. You're not going to like exaggerate, but there's a way to tell a story that makes it feel, it's more than watching paint dry. Like PayPal is a payment system. It's ultimately, this story is the story of a startup, but there's a way to tell that story that I think is evocative and engaging and like has all these crazy personalities at the heart of it. And I'm glad you said that, because it was what I was trying to do, was make people feel what that period was like when the internet was first being created and this group of people came together to build this company.
No, yeah. When I was reading it, the moment I would start getting into it, I was like, this is interesting. But I was gonna make you laugh. So one of the biggest genres right now is lit RPG, and it's kind of like what you're talking about, where you're going through those two. You have two different side doors. So yeah, I was like, when you're talking, that's funny.
That's funny. That is funny. And I would say that for me, it was more of those books. You know, I basically would just like check them out of the library, and then I would kind of like go through them, dog ear the pages, go back, make the other decision, go back. And I don't have any great big insight from that or anything. It was mostly just that I think that those books were really engaging for a kid. And at the same time, it was like, what would happen is if you went through one door, the book ended so quickly.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of like, well, that wasn't the entire book. Like I missed like 100 pages or whatever. So I'd go back and like go through it again. I think, when I think back on my like early reading, it's funny, and I don't know if this happens to everybody, but I used to read a lot more fiction than I do now. Like
Yeah.
I used to be basically exclusively fiction, and maybe that's just a kid thing. Like you just are like that way, and then you learn to like want information, and that's more
Exactly.
nonfiction. I don't have a good sort of precise insight there, but I'm glad for one thing, which is I'm glad for the fact that, one, I had a really good library near me, and two, I had uh just like I developed a reading habit. Like it became a thing that I actually enjoyed doing. And it's really, I don't envy. I mean, like I am a parent, but it's like very hard these days to have that same level of enthusiasm about it, because like the iPad is so much more, so
Yeah.
much more engaging.
Different world. And one thing when you're talking, it made me think of like the two-way door, like kind of what Jeff Bezos talks about. Like there's a two-way doors and one-way doors. And I think a lot of the people that you write about have that kind of personality where, they can shift, right? They can figure
Mhm.
out when we're making a startup, what is going to make us win. Like, can you talk a little bit like what inspired you to write biographies about like Claude Shannon, and then we'll get into PayPal as well.
Yeah, and I wrote an earlier book about an ancient Roman senator whose name was Cato. He was Julius Caesar's arch nemesis. That was kind of my first book. And then I wrote this biography on this guy named Claude Shannon, who he's one of the big figures in inventing the digital age. And he was a genius, and he was super interesting, and he had a ton of interests: stock picking, card counting. He built the world's first chess playing computer. Um, he was a really broad minded thinker. And then fast forward, I did The Founders, which was about the creation of PayPal, and a lot of names that people have heard: Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman. And I think, people have asked me like, what's the unifying thread on your work, or like, what's the theme of your body of work or whatever. And I'll just be honest, like I follow my nose in stories that are interesting where there hasn't been a good book written about that story. And the reason that it is that simple is because I don't want to do copycat work. I don't like doing the thing of like, oh, I should do a book like this, but for this. Um, I for each of my books, you won't find another version of my book, because they're just like, there's not going to be one once I've finished it, right? And so I look for that empty space on the bookshelf. And then what I try to do is fill it so that it'll never, like, nobody will ever try to do it again, right?
Yeah.
I think I can say with some confidence, like, nobody is going to do a version of the PayPal story that I did ever again. It would just be too hard, right? And there'd be no reason. I did everything, right? Claude Shannon, if you're looking for a Claude Shannon biography, my book is the biography of Claude Shannon, and no one's going to do another one. And it's not because I'm like patting myself on the back. It's more just, that's my goal as a writer, is like, I don't want to do something where I'm like, oh, I'm like the 18th biography of Einstein. It's like, well, okay, fine. Like there might be some value there, but like, does the world really need this? I
Yeah.
try to think a lot about, and I'm sure you do as well, where are the projects where if I don't do this, it might not happen,
Yeah.
and where it hasn't been done. And that's a really high bar. Like for me, that's like, oh man, like that's why I say no to most of the projects that I'm thinking about, is because somewhere along the way I'm like, man, somebody else could do this. This is somebody else's project, or I shouldn't take this on. But that's what I would say is, like, to answer your question, when I decide to take something on, it's because I go on Amazon, I try to buy a book about something I'm interested in. If I don't find it, I try to answer the question of like, why hasn't anybody done this? And then if the answer is basically like nobody did it because nobody did it, then I try to decide if I'm the right person to spend, let's say, between 3 and 6 years of my life
Yeah.
producing a book on it.
Yeah, it's the Edwin Land quote where he's basically like never do what someone else could do. Like it's like rule number
Yeah.
one is always do something original. And speaking
Yeah.
of that, like we did in this story specifically, we had two companies that were kind of fighting for a similar position in a sense, and they kind of united like an Avengers team, right? You got, like you said, you have PayPal. I mean, you got Confinity, and then you got X.com. What were like? How did you kind of figure that out? Or when I guess I should say, these intellectual powerhouses come together, like what created those companies, or like what made them successful from your research?
Yeah, I think it's a great question for a number of reasons. And what I would say is, like, so to take a step back, because a bunch of the people who are listening to this may not actually know like a lot of the history here,
Yeah.
right? And so it's probably worth like 30 seconds of background for people who haven't read the book. Um, if you know, it's highly likely that if you're listening to this, you've used PayPal at some point, or you've used one of its derivative products. You've maybe used Venmo, which is owned by PayPal. And so the idea basically is, where did modern PayPal come from? Well, modern PayPal was really created in 1999, actually 25 years ago this year. And it is the fusion of two companies. Those two companies, one company is called Confinity. Confinity is created by these two people named Max Levchin and Peter Thiel. And they set out to build, at the time, what they set out to build was this like app to allow Palm Pilots to beam money to each other. So actually kind of like ironically an early version of Venmo. There's this second company. It's owned by a guy named Elon Musk. Nobody really, no, he's not famous at the time, but he owns this URL, x.com, and he also wants to play in financial services. His idea is that x.com can become kind of the like super bank of the future. Anything related to money, he wants x.com to do, including, let's say, my ability to send Kyle $10 digitally. And so both of these companies are doing money transfer. They're like figuring out ways for me to make it easier to get Kyle money, whether that's through a Palm Pilot or whether that's through an email address. In late 1999, both of these companies become a big hit on a website called eBay.
Yeah.
And again, for listeners who don't know, eBay auction website, you probably know it. It was huge back in the day. It's still a publicly traded company, still has, but it was like hot back in the late 90s. Everybody's suddenly like thinking, oh, this is like the way commerce is going to work in the future. And so what eBay didn't have was a way for auction buyers to pay auction sellers that was super easy. So Kyle, let's say you auction off, and maybe one day you will, that Bookum hat, right?
Yeah.
I buy it on eBay. I have the winning bid, say it's $20. And there, at the end of that transaction, eBay basically says like, great, Kyle and Jimmy, feel free to figure out however you want to pay each other. So maybe I'd send you a check, maybe I'd send you cash. I don't know how I would send it to you. And into that void steps these two companies, which allows me to pay you either through X.com's money transfer platform or through Confinity's service that they called PayPal. What happens is they basically get into this arms race against each other in late 1999 and early 2000. And they end up merging in this kind of shotgun wedding. So these two teams are brought together. It's like a 6-week process. It's super fast.
Right.
And you have a lot of firepower in the room. You have a lot of very smart people in the room. And I would say, just taking one more step back, for listeners who don't know the phrase PayPal Mafia, the reason this story really matters is because the people who created almost every product and service, like you've probably used a product or service that's linked to one of the people who created this company. So if you've ever watched a YouTube video, the YouTube founders worked at PayPal. Yep. LinkedIn, founder worked at PayPal. Tesla, SpaceX, Palantir, Yammer, the first investment dollars into Facebook all started at PayPal. And all of these people work together from 1999 to 2002 to build this company from scratch. It was, for many of them, it was their first startup experience, and they went on to have many other startup experiences. I wanted to answer the question with the book, well, how the hell did you all end up at one place? That's just the statistical odds of that are like a million to one. I was like, how did that even happen? Because to have like even one of these people in a room by themselves is really impressive. But to have the founder of SpaceX like working shoulder to shoulder with the founder of YouTube, working shoulder to shoulder with the founder of LinkedIn, like that's bananas. And so that's what I was trying to figure out. And hopefully that's enough context for your listeners on why this book matters. This is the formative experience for an entire generation of technological talent. And a lot of what happened later drew on what happened at PayPal.
Yeah, because before your book, there would just be like that one meme you always saw where it's like showing all the companies that came out of PayPal, and you'd hear them say, you saw that photo where it's like the PayPal Mafia is all sitting there. And so that's kind of like what you mostly heard. And then you heard them tell stories here and there. So the way you distilled it all into this book, you get everything, right? And one thing I noticed was that David Sachs talked about, instead of it, he said he thought of it more of a diaspora than a mafia. So I'm in your opinion, what makes what they built more of a diaspora or a mafia, or do you even, yeah, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple reasons why, and I think if you were to, like, I interviewed a lot of people for this book, right? Over 200 people. And one of the things is that it really, some of the answer to that question depends on who you ask. But I was able to look at it from a sort of 10,000 foot view. Like, why did PayPal go on to birth all of these companies? We have a PayPal Mafia. Why don't we have a Google Mafia, right? Why don't we have like another insert Mafia, insert company name Mafia? And there's a couple of reasons why. One key reason is this. The company was successful. So it was like one of these things where like so many internet companies were created in the late 90s that didn't succeed. But the people who were part of this company, as Peter Thiel basically put it like this, he said, we had the experience of something being very hard, but we were actually successful with it. So the lesson that people learned is that you could do hard things in this space and win, right? As opposed to like if it had been really hard and everybody failed, maybe they all would have gone and done something completely different, right? And so you have a situation in which it was hard, but they succeeded. That's one reason, is like they learned the lesson, hey, you can make an internet company and take it public someday and make a lot of money doing it. That sort of thing. One. Thing two is the company was acquired after it went public, and a lot of very talented people used the acquisition as an opportunity to leave. So they didn't stay with the company for a really long time, meaning they went off and like did other things, right? They didn't want to stay there. They wanted to go off and like create new companies, create YouTube, create LinkedIn, create Tesla, create SpaceX. And the way he described it, David Sachs quite colorfully described it. He said, we were a little like the Israelites, like Jewish people. He was like, they burned down our temple and we had to all find different ways to survive, right? And he made that joke, but it's sort of an apt description. Like what happened is this company, eBay, came and acquired PayPal. And these people all had to find different things to do after, right? They weren't all, they all left, some of them left willingly, but they all had to find like new ventures, new things to create. I would say the third key reason is if you look at where the investment dollars came in for a lot of these early startups that these people went off to create, a lot of that money came from other people who worked with them at PayPal. A lot of the early employees who worked together to create new companies came from the PayPal alumni group. So I'll give you an example. The two co-founders of a company called Yelp, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with, both worked at PayPal together, Russ Simmons and Jeremy Stoppelman. The first money into Yelp came from their colleague at PayPal, Max Levchin, who really was like, you guys are smart. You're creating this company. Here's a check. Let's see what happens. And, that company obviously grew to become very big. It's a publicly traded company, all the things. But there was a little bit of like, you had access to a network that could give you capital and a network where you could draw upon these people to get talented hires and talented co-founders. So there's a lot of other reasons why there is a PayPal Mafia or a PayPal Diaspora, but those are sort of three big reasons why.
No, I was going to say, I watched another interview of yours and you were talking about the mere fact that this company survived is crazy. And that's why you said, as soon as they got to IPO, they're like, all right, we need to go, we got to go try different things. I have other visions. I don't want my life to just only be PayPal, which ultimately gave us some of the, like you said, Yammer, LinkedIn, all these things that we kind of use now. Speaking of that, I kind of want to know, like, there's a lot of books that are written about company cultures. Like I know Netflix has Freedom and Responsibility is kind of like their ingrained culture. What made PayPal's culture unique and different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something I tried to bottle in the book itself, because what's funny is they never actually sat around and talked about culture. So that I would say I would actually joke that if the answer to that question might be the culture would have been oriented around the idea survive until tomorrow, right? Like, so more context for your listeners. In March of 1999, the internet bubble bursts, and the NASDAQ that year loses like 80% of its value. You have companies that had like gotten millions of dollars of investment that by the end of the year were bankrupt. It is a massive reckoning for that sector. And in the face of that reckoning, you have this company, PayPal, that is burning a lot of money on fraud, trying to build this service that works. It's growing. They have this shotgun wedding of a merger. And so the challenge was just surviving. Like it was like survival to get to the next month, to get to the next quarter. And then eventually the wheel turns and they do actually manage to like make the business work, right? But I would say that part of the culture was just like hiring insanely talented people and having this pressure to survive, right? Because it wasn't like they sat around doing trust falls or like defining what the values were or any of that stuff. There just wasn't, honestly, when I interviewed the people there, they would say there wasn't enough time for that. I had this person, and I think I wrote this in the book. It's been a couple of years since I wrote it, so forgive me if I get anything wrong. But this person I interviewed said to me, at a lot of other companies, you'll get into these food fights about titles. Like, I'm the VP of this and this, but you're the VP of that, and we have to fight about it because that overlaps in my territory. He said, we had so much going on that a lot of the fights that actually like can slow companies down, they just didn't happen because there was just too much to do. And we kept worrying that the next day would be the day that we would wake up and the company was done, like we were finished, right? And that is actually it's a really interesting insight, which is like the minor things fell to the wayside in favor of the major thing, and the major thing was surviving and figuring out how to make the company work. And so I would say that like if I had to describe the culture, I'd basically describe it as a culture of just like working blindingly hard, hiring ridiculously smart people, and trying to survive to the next month.
Yeah, it's the Jimmy Valvano, like survive in advance, like NC State. That's basically what it is.
Yeah, that's
and it
right.
kind of reminds me of also Reid Hoffman in his Masters of Scale. He talks about like jumping off a company is like jumping off a cliff and assembling the plane on the way down. And that really is the story of this PayPal and X. And speaking of X.com, it had a much larger vision, right? It was like supposed to be like the global transition of all money, or center of all money. Now that Elon has X.com now, do you think that bigger vision is still getting implemented, or do you think it's too late because of all these things that kind of happened since? Like you have PayPal and Stripe and all these different things. You think that vision's long gone?
Let me offer a couple thoughts. The first is that Elon's vision of X.com being the global center for all money is actually a kind of like interesting, we haven't, in some ways, like he hasn't seen that and that exist anywhere else. And he still sees all the problems in financial services that led him to do X.com in the first place. So here's a good example. People still pay a fair amount of money to transmit, like they pay fees to transmit money. So if I were wire transferring something to you and I was using, let's say, a traditional retail bank like Chase, I think Chase charges like $15 for me to wire transfer you money, right? Not all banks do this, but let's say Chase does. And for him, it's like, well, I'm not actually like taking a physical sack of money and shipping it to Kyle. So what is the fee for it? And his view was like, all you're doing is moving zeros in a database. So why does this cost anything? we still have a lot of fees in the financial services sector. We still have a lot of inefficiency in the financial services sector. Doing things like cross-border payments is still very expensive, in spite of the fact that the world is digitized. So his view is like X.com should just be an accelerant for the digitization of finance and the faster and cheaper flow of money, which is why he wanted X.com to be where all the money was, as he put it in the book. The challenge is that there are, like you said, a lot of services that do various pieces of this now. You asked whether I think he can succeed. I don't know enough to know whether he'll be successful with the latest iteration of X.com, but I did learn, just it's never a good idea to bet against Elon in these situations. Like, he has an extraordinary ability to bring a vision that he has that seems fanciful into life and then make success out of it. And so it was one of the things Peter Thiel said to me. He's like, I've just learned never to bet against Elon, right? And one of the things that is true is that I suspect that he was 20 years ahead back in 1999 when he was working on X.com, because a lot of the technology that we needed to make something like X.com successful wasn't available. But it's a question of whether in the 20 years that have passed since, have we gotten far enough along that it's not a big enough vision now? I'm not a financial services technology person. I studied one story, PayPal, very specifically, but I would say that there's I think it's a harder sell today to tell people like, I want all your money and your mortgage and your insurance to be in one place. I also think just honestly, the laws have gotten a little complicated and cumbersome with these things. So it's a little harder to make it take off.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, like, since your book came out, there's been a lot that's happened now. You got, like I said, you got the X.com. I mean, you have X as in past Twitter. And then you have the emergence of cryptocurrency and AI and stuff. Like, I'm just interested that maybe it's gone too far, but there is still a lot that you're saying that is available now that wasn't there in the 90s.
One comment on that, because it's kind of important, is that there are a fair number of very close parallels in the language that early crypto people used and in what these PayPal creators were using. At one point, there were T-shirts that said PayPal, the new world currency. They thought at one point that what they were going to do was disrupt all global currencies. Does that sound familiar? I mean, that's kind of what folks in the cryptocurrency space want to do as well. And so, these ambitions have a way of like being cyclical. They come back. Like, a new generation of entrepreneurs wants to create a new currency. But there are actually a fair number of the folks who were early PayPal that thought what PayPal was supposed to do was to be a universal currency that could go around the world in the same way that, Bitcoin or Ethereum or some of these others have.
Yeah, and I kind of want to shift into some characters. One of the things I loved about your book is you went into some of the women that worked at PayPal, because you don't really hear about them as much. Like, can you talk a little bit about their overall impact to the company?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many superstars, men and women, throughout this story. And what happened, it's a funny thing in these stories. Like, there are some people who get an email and they get asked to participate in projects, and there are some people who don't. And my thought was, when I started the project, like, why not just email everybody who ever worked at the company and see if they want to talk to me? And so what would happen is I would email somebody and they would say, you're the first person to ever email me to ask about PayPal. And part of that is, like, if you think about it, if you're Elon Musk, you're getting asked questions all the time. You're going to be asked about everything from like what you did when you were a kid to like what was PayPal like to what is SpaceX like, all these things. But if you aren't famous, maybe nobody even knows you worked at PayPal. So what I would have to do a lot of times, I'd like cross-reference and see on LinkedIn, like, let's say it's you, like, did Kyle work at PayPal between the years 1999 and 2002? Okay, great. I should email that person. And so in that process, I found a lot of people who had basically been like left out of the storytelling around this company. And a fair number of it's also just the nature of the way these things are reported on. Like, men get more coverage than women, and it's unfair. And so I was like, okay, well, I just interview the women. It wasn't, for me, I wasn't like trying to strike a blow for social justice, nothing like that.
No, yeah.
It was more just like, I was like, well, everybody who works at the company should hear from me. If they want to talk to me, that would be amazing. And if they don't, fine. But I was kind of like, let me just canvass the earth and find all these people. And so I found people all over the world. I was interviewing people in multiple time zones. I was interviewing people who lived in India. I was interviewing people who lived, in Asia, in Europe. And I would say that like if people read the book, what I hope they find is that the company is not all Elons. It's not all Max Levchins. It's not all these like brilliant, young coder types, engineering types. There are a lot of people who make this company work successfully. And I hope I did a good job of capturing just like the array of people who were a part of this, right? And they're an incredible group, and they continue to do incredible things to this day.
No, it made for a unique story. Like even with the way they did the phone bake, where they're like is trying to figure out a problem. That all right, I have a friend that works in this area, and we can get the phone bank to make sure our customer service works. And they're just like certain interesting stories like that. And even when you read something like Walter Isaacson's book, and he talks about Elon, it was that same level of all right. I think he gave a story about the servers were messing up, and he's like, well, how long is it going to take us to get these things fixed? And they're like, oh, it's going to take months. He's like, no, we're going to get this done quick. And I think there's a level of recruiting and like a wherewithal there with Elon specifically too. Like, can you talk a bit about like their recruiting styles because of all these different characters that came to the company?
Yeah, it's an interesting, it's a great question. It is, I think, one of the superpowers of some of the people at the heart of the story that people underestimate. Like engineers want to work for Elon, right? Not all of them, but enough of them. And like he's a very good judge of talent, and he's a very good recruiter of talent. So I'll tell you a story. There's like a story in the book, but I can kind of expand on it. There's this guy I interviewed a couple times. His name is Sanjay Bhargava, and Sanjay had like a failed startup experience, and he was like looking around for what to do. And somebody introduced him to Elon over email. Elon was hiring for X.com. And he said, and they kind of have this chit chat over email. He's like, oh, I'm looking for something new to do. And Elon's like, well, why don't we chat like about you working here? And he's like, great. The next time I'm in your area, you and I can meet up. And Elon's like, no. I want you to come down like now. And so he, I think, flew down or something to meet with him. They meet that night. They start their dinner/interview at like 8 o'clock. They talk until 4 o'clock in the morning. And then Elon says, okay, can you come to the office in 4 hours and collect your offer letter? Right. And so he meant like, don't like just come 4 hours later, go get 3 hours sleep, clean yourself up, come to the office. I'll give you your offer letter. But he's both and Sanjay ends up building one of the most important innovations that made the company successful. And so Elon has a great eye for talent, and then he's also an aggressive recruiter of talent. And that is true of Max Levchin, and it's true of Peter Thiel, and it's true of all of these people that they were just exceptional at this. Like they were exceptional at building teams of people who could succeed in this kind of environment. And that I hope is something that like comes through in the story, is that it's not just that like you have one person who's like a super genius and can solve all the problems. It's actually that like what they do is they attract and inspire people and teams who can build these things and make them successful.
Yeah, I think when you think about their company too, it is that 0 to 1. Like the book to me explains 0 to 1. Like when I was reading your book, I was like, okay, now I can understand it a lot better, because everything they did, they started very niche. They started with, like you said, it was just like beaming money to Palm Pilots, and then there's all this thing, and then the way they attacked eBay, and they're like, oh, no one knows how to do this, and everybody's using our system on eBay. It's just very unique about a lot of the integrations of their company.
Yeah, it was a company that I'm glad you said that, because it was definitely, I wasn't consciously doing it, but I've had a couple people tell me, they were like, you sort of read 0 to 1, and then your book helps explain where 0 to 1 came from, right? And I'm like, that's high praise. But there are a lot of lessons that came from PayPal that applied to future things that these people did, including Peter Thiel, who's the author of 0 to 1. I'll give you actually one example that's not in the book. This story is, I just didn't have room to publish it, and there were a bunch of reasons why I was like, it's just going to take it's a too far field. But one of the things that PayPal did very well is they designed technology that could be embedded on other websites. So if you, Kyle, had a page or a store like online, and you wanted to embed a PayPal button, they made that very easy for you to do. It was a little bit of code, and it was one of the first times that somebody had really like gotten buttons to be that easy to use. Fast forward, YouTube is being created. And the YouTube founders worked at PayPal. They knew how powerful it was to have technology that's easily embeddable onto other web pages. So they create an embed system. And the embed system works super well on this website called MySpace that is taking off. Some of your listeners might remember, like at one point, MySpace was the hot social network of the moment. And so then all these users start posting YouTube videos onto MySpace. MySpace, the people who are running it are like, what is this? We got to shut this down. So they shut down, like, the ability to do that. And what the PayPal folks who worked at YouTube and were creating YouTube remembered is that anytime a user is using your product, you can get them to revolt against the person who's making their life harder. So they put up a phone number for the MySpace office, and they put up an email address and said, if you're unhappy about YouTube being blocked on MySpace, just call these people and annoy them and get them to turn the rules around. And that's exactly what happened. But that strategy is exactly what PayPal did with eBay. Anytime eBay tried to like eliminate the button or change the button or monkey with this payment system, the PayPal folks would make hay, and they would get the users to create the protest. So it's just a long way of saying, like, part of the reason this book still has relevance is because a lot of the strategies that emerged from PayPal are strategies that these folks are still using to this day.
Yeah, it doesn't stop. And when you're talking about strategy, I thought about how all of them are very much gamers too, right? You had Elon that plays games. Reid Hoffman's like one of the top board game guys. Like he plays Catan and all these other different games. How did in Max was into games all the well as well? Like, how did gaming like help their company in the sense of like strategy? And did you even think about that in that sense when you're writing this book?
Well, I don't know that it helped the company. I think it was a big part of the culture, right? So it was sort of like a lot of people there loved playing games like chess or Go or poker or whatever. It was a part of like the atmosphere of the place. Like I have these photos that people shared with me of like late night games of poker that are happening like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. At the IPO party, they famously set up 10 chessboards, and Peter played 10 simultaneous games of chess. Chess playing, puzzle solving, it was all part of the place. To the extent it helped the company, it was more that they selected for people who were really, really good at solving puzzles and really good at this kind of thinking. And part of what they needed to do when they were creating the company is solve like hundreds, if not thousands, of different intricate puzzles, right? And so you could imagine that if you're very good at like strategy games, or if you're very good at puzzle solving, you might naturally fit in an environment where like everything, the battle against eBay feels like a strategy game. The battle against regulators feels like a strategy game. You're playing the most epic chess game against a competitor. There's a fit there, but it wasn't a direct one-to-one fit.
No, it makes sense. I also want to get into Max Levchin because he's a big part of this story. Being an immigrant computer science student. And he was at Illinois too, University of Illinois. Okay, and I know that was a big hub for what became a lot of the internet with Netscape and all those things. But I want to know like what made him unique and like perfect to start Confinity in that sense. Like what was his secret sauce from when you were talking to him?
Yeah, he's an unsung hero in this story. He's the co-founder of the company, and people in Silicon Valley know the name Max Levchin. He's well regarded. He's well respected. Today, he's the CEO of a company called Affirm.
Yeah,
but a lot of people don't actually know his story. He's not sort of become like colossally world famous in the way that a lot of these other folks have, right? And I think I would say if I had to guess, it's by choice. I think he prefers to do what he's going to do in the world, right? He likes, as he once put it, he's like, I like creating companies. Like it's sort of like what he likes doing is building tech companies. And he's done that with some success over the years. He is he was interesting. I kicked the book off with him, and I really went deep on his story because he is he is the earliest co-founder, and a lot of the technology team is recruited to PayPal because of Max. He's also just, ferociously smart and insanely hardworking. There are these legendary stories of him pulling like back-to-back all-nighters to get things done, right? Or kind of finding some way to fix some impossible problem, right? That nobody else could solve. So there's a sort of quality of like, you have to just acknowledge that he is a genius. He's also ridiculously hardworking. And those two qualities make for success in Silicon Valley. The other thing I would say is that he had the ability to know that people like Peter Thiel knew things that he didn't know. And so he's very conscious about choosing partners, who are like kind of filling his gaps. Like a good example is like at one point, they asked Max, I guess, to make like a PowerPoint deck for the company. And Max was just like, I guess either he didn't make it or he made some product that was like just not going to work. And Peter was just like, we're going to handle this. Like you don't need to worry about this. So there's a way in which like there's a complementarity of skills that Max has with Peter. But Max's story itself is super inspiring. He comes here with the help. He comes to America with the help of a Jewish refugee relief agency. He leaves Ukraine, comes to the United States. He's in high school when he arrives here, manages to get to the University of Illinois, then manages to make it out west. And he's one of the great American immigrant success stories. Like he has created multiple companies, sold multiple companies. He's an investor in a bunch of different things across Silicon Valley. And I wanted the reader to walk through his full journey, because there was so much about the fraud fighting systems at PayPal that drew upon his early life, that I wanted readers to see how that arc followed. So like when Max is playing with computers when he's a kid, there's so much of that plants the seeds for PayPal's later success.
Yeah.
And I wanted people to be able to walk that journey with him.
Yeah. And like I said, that's why I keep saying this, the way you wrote it, it plays out like a movie. Like even those like small moments we get of knowing his childhood then comes later into the film, or like the way David Sachs comes into the knowing them from school. It's just like all these unique cameos that kind of happen, and then all then also blend to make a really unique company.
I think that's right, and I hope from your lips to Hollywood's ears. Drake's production company, the rapper Drake, they bought part of the rights to this project along with several other folks, including David Sachs and Jack Selby, because they want to turn it into something on screen. I hope it happens. I'm not a Hollywood person, so I don't know the likelihood of success. But here's what I would say. It's a very dramatic story, right? Like people think of a startup and they're like, well, you built a company. Yeah, during the middle of this company, they have 3 CEOs, 2 coup attempts, 9/11 happens. The company almost like loses its technology a bunch of times. Like, there's like a bunch of stuff that happens that makes for a lot of high drama. There's also a lot of big personalities who are constantly in conflict with each other. And so the way I always describe it to people is it's like Shakespeare set in Silicon Valley with a bunch of coders. There's ego and there's ambition and there's like fighting, but there's also like real genuine bonds of affection and friendship. And so I'm glad that came through, because I was really trying to capture the human narrative in addition to the business narrative, right? Ultimately, this is a business made up of people, and you have to sort of tell their stories to understand the business itself.
Yeah, and speaking of like kind of the film arc, I think we have to talk a little bit about the coup. Like you just talk a little bit about that, and like for viewers that didn't know, and just some insight about like kind of how that happened for everybody.
Yeah, so to take a step back, so I described for you earlier this shotgun wedding between these 2 companies, Elon Musk's company X.com and this company Confinity that had this product PayPal that was created by Max Levchin and Peter Thiel. Well, at one point, Elon becomes CEO of this combined entity. And in late summer of 2000, a move is made against him that is led by the people who created Confinity. And they oust him from the company. They basically go to the board and they say, look, we've collected a bunch of signatures. It's either him or it's all of these other people. And the board sides with, and they, by the way, they somewhat, unfortunately, depending on who you ask, they do this while he's on his honeymoon. So he has to fly back from his honeymoon. And when he arrives back, he's learned that the board has voted against him. So Elon is now ousted from this company. It's a really hard moment for him personally. I mean, people may mock it now, but like he built this company, he built half this company. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of revisionist history that ignores the role that he played in hiring a lot of key people. At the same time, the leaders on the Confinity side said, look, his big ambition for this company, this bank to rule all banks, the place where all money is going to be, that's great. We can't do that right now because we need to focus on me being able to pay Kyle $10 without being defrauded, right? And so he's ousted. And, there's sort of 2 ways to tell the story. One is to tell the story of like, wow, wasn't it so bad that Elon was ousted from this company that he created that became PayPal? The other way to tell the story is, thank goodness, because it led him to have the room and the time to create SpaceX and Tesla. And he himself, when I interviewed him, he kind of acknowledged this. He sort of, in his own halting way, he said, it all did work out in the end, because if I had been at PayPal, I probably would have just kept going to try to make it a $1 trillion company. And that was his view, was like, I would have just continued to try to make this bigger as opposed to going off and doing Tesla and SpaceX. So in some ways, we're all the beneficiaries of the fact that he was ousted in the summer of 2000, right? Because now other companies exist as a result of that.
Yeah, and again, he goes on to do all these other different companies, and just the continuous of that recruiting, because even a lot of the recruiting from OpenAI is a lot you've learned now is that Elon was a big part of that. So I think all these different companies, what made him unique is also, it's kind of like the Steve Jobs, where he's like, I hire people that are smarter than me. I think this company was a bunch of companies like with leaders on top of leaders on top of leaders. So they were able to do unique things with this company.
That's right.
Yep. So I want to kind of shift just into your writing process as we kind of wrap up. Like, what was your writing process like for this book? Some of the reviews, or getting the interviews, how that whole worked out for you?
Yeah, I feel like I have to add a disclaimer of like, don't try this at home, kids. Like, don't try this is not to be emulated. I mean, this was a really hard book to write, right? Yeah. I had this author friend of mine who said, the trick is making it look easy. And I sort of was like, sure, but like, we should also just be honest about how hard it is, I mean, this book took 6 years end to end. You don't just get to waltz into Elon's office and ask him questions. It took me a long time to earn the trust of these people. I had to dig around through a lot of paper, thousands of pages of documents. So basically what I would do to get it done was I would wake up every day super early, and I would start my day like at 4 o'clock in the morning, sometimes earlier, sometimes a little later. And I would basically make PayPal the first thing I worked on for like 7 days a week. So I'd write from like 4 to 9. And then I would go off and like do real work, like paying work, not the book. And I basically did that for years on end until the book was done. I did a lot of interviews, but a lot of it is you just wake up, you put words on the page, you go back, you clean up the words you do. People act like this is glamorous. It's really not. Like a lot of the writer's life is just sitting in a chair by yourself, processing information and trying to think like, when Kyle reads this book, how am I going to make a scene come to life for him? Like when, let's say one of your listeners picks up the book, and I hope you do, when you get to the page about fraud fighting, how do I make fraud fighting come to life for you? Right. And like, for me, it was like, I would like root around and I'd find stories like, oh, the crazy FBI raid that I found, which involved PayPal, this FBI raid. Let's make the raid the opening sequence of this so that it's like an episode of Law and Order or something. Right. and it's all factual. It's all real, but I need to make people understand how this works. And I need to make it interesting to read so that you turn the page. Right. And if I have like vans and FBI agents and windbreakers and guns and stuff, in addition to like, here's why PayPal is involved in this, it makes it real for readers. But the only way you do that is you sit every morning with this material and you listen to interviews again and again and again. And you think to yourself, like, what am I going to do with this? Like, how is this ever going to work? Right. And that's the process, is you just wake up every day and you do it. It sounds really simple, but it's not. It's excruciatingly hard and terrible. Actually, and a lot of the time you don't enjoy it. Like, this is the reason I sort of said, don't try this at home. Doing this kind of work, it's kind of thankless most of the time, right? Like you kind of, I mean, and by the way, I had the disclaimer, like not everybody does books the way that I do them. I'm unusually intense, I think, compared to some of my author friends. Like, I have to go all in on a project, and it becomes like my entire life, right? And it just becomes the center of my universe in a way that very few other things can. And so this is what works for me. It doesn't work for everybody else, but I find that like for me, I just have to get into a rhythm of daily, every single day. There's no holidays, there's no breaks. You just keep going. And you learn more that way. It makes the book interesting that way. You find new nuggets that way. But that's my process, is just wake up. It's also the reason I wake up so early. People are like, why do writers often get up so early? It's because the rest of the world is asleep and you guys don't bother us. Right. That's the truth. Nobody texts you at 4 o'clock in the morning to hang out. Nobody like sends a meme at 5:30 a.m. Right? Actually, that's not true. A few of my friends do, but they're like me. But like, the fact is, like, it's the time when you're least likely to be distracted, you're least likely to be bothered, that kind of stuff. And that's how my work gets done.
No, yeah, I always want to make sure I ask writers just their process, because it is, writing is such a unique skill, like, and you need it. Like, reading helps obviously clear up your writing, and then writing also clears up like when you read things. So it's one of those skills that it helps you see the world better. It helps you clear up the way the world is to you, and it makes the stories unique. It makes us want to read them. So, and even like the captcha story, like I was sitting there, I was like, how he has made this a unique part of this story now. Like it didn't have to be, but then you go like a lot of the internet is built like that now, like the way we protect our companies and stuff.
That's right. That's right. And the captcha is a great example of, I didn't know that the captcha, this is for listeners who are like, anytime you have to like go like look through some scrambled letters and type them in, or like match like a fire hydrant to another fire hydrant or whatever, to authenticate that you're a human, you're using technology that was built at PayPal. PayPal created that to be able to separate humans from robots who are trying to defraud users. And so that was an origin story. I had to go back and trace where that came from. And it came from Max Levchin and David Gauzabek. And the original name for the captcha was the Gauzabek-Levchin test. And it was a test to separate humans from robots. But now we use it literally all over the internet. And so finding those stories is like a lot of the fun. Like I often tell friends, I'm like a low budget Indiana Jones. Like it's like I basically am just rooting around, like trying to find these little nuggets. And then if I find them, magic can happen on the page.
Yeah, as we wind down, I always like to ask people like, what is the last book you read? What are you reading now? And what do you plan to read next?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm like looking over on my list right now. Okay. So the last book I read was this book, Paper Belt on Fire. It's actually written by a friend of mine. His name is Michael Gibson. It's a really good book about his journey creating the Teal Fellowship and kind of like rooting around in the world of technology investing. It's called Paper Belt on Fire. It's exceptional. The book I'm in the middle of right now is I'm in the middle of a couple books. One is called Richer, Wiser, Happier by William Green. It's a book about investors and investing. And then the other book is one of my favorite biographies, John Adams by David McCullough, who's just like, it's a great book. I read it like 10 years ago and I just wanted to revisit it. And so that's I'm in the middle of a couple of them, but I'm kind of always sort of in the middle of like 5 or 6 books at once, and I'll just pick up whatever strikes me on that given day.
Perfect. Yeah. And the way we always end this podcast, what should be in a founder's toolkit and what should be in an author's toolkit?
Oh, interesting. So you mean like tools, like just like help me understand, like you mean like apps, or do you mean like what do you mean?
So I kind of let it be a little bit open to you. It could be like some people talk about, oh, founders need grit or they need this, or like a writer, like I know Stephen King kind of talks about on writing, like you need the grammar kit. So it can be, you can kind of take it however you want, but I like to leave it open.
Yeah, no, I would say that for founders, I would say willpower. Like you can get a lot of mileage out of willpower. You don't have to be a genius. You just have to be willing to not quit longer than everybody else. I think that you'll find that at the heart of a lot of Silicon Valley success stories is just like an indomitable will to win. For authors, I would say it's actually very similar. I'd say the same answer for both. Like there are a lot of books that don't get written because somebody doesn't have the staying power to stick with it long enough to write it. Yeah. And as I described, like a lot of book writing is just deciding like this idea needs to exist in the world, and I am going to fight like hell to get it to exist in the world. And there's a lot of obstacles in the way, but I'm just going to keep going, and I'm just going to keep going. And if I get up and I do that and other people don't, I'll have a book. And like, again, sounds kind of basic, but it's really hard to do because you get bored, you get frustrated, you get tired, you have periods where you don't want to write. But that's where the answer comes in. It's like willpower. Like a lot of this is just comes down to like, brass tacks. Do you want to wake up every day and grind against this thing, or do you not?
No, very well said. Jimmy, it's been a pleasure. Everybody, make sure you get a copy of The Founders. Jimmy, please let us know anything that's coming up in your world or how we can support or where to find you.
Oh, I really appreciate that. You know, I would say buy the books, whether that's Rome's Last Citizen or The Founders or Mind at Play. I think people will enjoy them. And then if you want to engage, like I'm not the most active person on X Twitter, but I'm there every now and again. I engage every now and again. And then, you know, I just like to hear what readers are thinking about my books. Like just let me know. Let me know what you think. Find my email or reach out to me on X or LinkedIn or whatever platform you use. But you know, that would be great. Like it thrills me when people read the books and get something out of them. It's the reason you do the work. And so it'd be great to hear from people who are having that experience.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, we'll make sure to share about it, and yeah, keep writing because we love your writing, man. I appreciate you.
Awesome, Kyle. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It means a lot, and I'm glad you're building an app to both get people to read more books and then bring book lovers together because you're doing a great service. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.